maybe. Okay, let me just switch. Working? Yeah, perfect. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming here, and thank you for TCDC for hosting our presentation. We hope that you enjoy what we have in store for you today. So the talk is resilience as a process, and that's sort of the theme of this entire week. But I think in secret, by the end of the presentation, you'll find that this is really a presentation about empowerment. Now is the time for empowerment more than ever. Yesterday, there was a very tragic shooting in the shopping center, and it's terrible what happened. And we face these sorts of tragedies and challenges more and more in the modern world. And I think what's very important is that as people, we should feel empowered to be able to actually do something about the problems that we see and to be the changes that we want to see in the world. So with that, to us, resilience really is about accepting the challenge to overcome something that you thought you couldn't. And with that, this is us.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jenjira, and I'm currently an architect working here in Thailand. My educational background is in architecture, where I studied at UCLA, and I met Pibom. And I did my master at Harvard in landscape architecture, where I did some thesis and research project on urban ecology, as well as invasive species in Thailand.
And hello again, everybody. My name is Yuri. I graduated from Stanford with a degree in design research. And over the last year, 2 years almost, I've been studying resilience as a process. And a lot of what we're going to see today has been a culmination of this work, along with the rest of us putting our time and effort into this.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. My name is Paricha Dwang Tawisap. My nickname is Bomb. I have a background in chemical engineering, and I also completed my master's degree in design at Stanford University, where I met Yuri. And I'm currently a design researcher and a partner at Amplifi Design, and we are a consultancy that uses the design thinking methodology to help transform organizational culture so that companies can go out and innovate on new products, services, and experiences. And with that introduction, I would like to pass this talk over to Nan. Thank you.
All right. So before we start to talk about how we as individuals, communities, and institutions can adapt to stresses in daily life, I would like to introduce a case study here in Thailand about water hyacinth and how local people here adapt to these stresses. So when you think about water hyacinth, what's the first image that came to mind? Is it this one single or two plants together just floating along the river? Or is it these massive giant green mats that just take over parts of the riverbanks? I think for most of people, this is what they're thinking about water hyacinth. And so what is actually water hyacinth? And so water hyacinth is this very invasive aquatic plants that grew massively fast, and it's actually not native to Bangkok. It was introduced a couple, I think, decades ago from Java, hence the name in Thai, Pak Top Chawa, Indonesia. And so it was introduced because of these ornamental flowers, but because of its ability to reproduce quickly, it took over a lot of water bodies around Thailand. Actually, also as well in other places, in tropical places such as Australia, Florida in the States, Bangladesh even. And so why is water hyacinth so invasive? Actually, we have to look at its characteristics and its ability to reproduce, because actually one single plant, water hyacinth, can produce up to 5,000 seeds. That's a lot of seeds, right? And one single seed can stay dormant for at least 30 years. So they can be like a seed for, like 20 years and then suddenly just germinate into a plant. And actually one single plant can reproduce into 15 plants in 20 days. That's really fast for a plant to reproduce, right? And that's because it can cross-pollinate and can self-clone itself. So it doesn't even need a pollinator. And here's a map that shows potential areas where water hyacinth can reproduce and can adapt. And so here we see in Thailand, right? There's a red and orange color showing that, okay, this is like the perfect place for water hyacinth. And actually, because of climate change and global warming, a lot of other places, colder places, will start to, the water hyacinth will start to emerge. And so we have to start to think like how can we actually adapt to this plant, right? Because there's no way that we can completely eradicate. And so why is water hyacinth such a big problem here? So we see here a big cluster of water hyacinth here just accumulating along the side of the river. Actually, this is not a fully grown water hyacinth. It's actually like being cut up by the mortars from the boats. And a lot of trashes are accumulated along with the water hyacinth. But also because the waterways in Bangkok is one of the main ways that we use to transit or get from one place to another. It's a very important, ways that we can transit. But also water hyacinth, if there's too many of them, they can block the waterways and a lot of boats will get stuck. It causes loss of time and stress. But also there are also a lot of environmental values and socio-economic values to water hyacinth. For example, here we see a lot of birds. This is the white egret that actually fly over to find these water mats and try to find food within that areas. And there's a lot of snails that lay eggs, a lot of frogs that kind of breathe in the area. But on the other hand, a lot of families rely a lot on water hyacinth. They harvest water hyacinth and dry them along the roads on the roof, and they sometimes sell them to agencies in bulk. And also you start to see here, some people just weave them into some products and sell them for extra money, or some even invented a way to make into biodegradable plates. Okay, so how are we currently dealing with water hyacinth? This is one of the most common ways that we've seen that people here in Bangkok are dealing with water hyacinth. We see these yellow boats that go in and people physically picking up water hyacinth and putting them on the boats. And sometimes they use this water hyacinth for fertilizer, for example. But there's another way that has been done up north of Thailand, where local people are trying to use more local and sustainable ways to capture water hyacinth, to save more time, more money, and energy. And so here we've seen that people are trying to understand how the water works, the river works, because actually the direction of the flow of the river are highly impacted by high tide and low tide from the sea, right? And so if you have low tide, the water flow down south to the sea. And if you have higher tide, then the water will flow upstream. And so, which means that these water hyacinths would move with the water up and down, depending on high tide and low tide. And so the local people study this pattern and use this to capture water hyacinth. And so during low tide, where the water is flowing downstream, the local people will bring up these bamboo stalks and try to accumulate them in such a way that when there's higher tide, the water hyacinth will not be able to come back up. So kind of blocking it in a way so that the water hyacinth will not be able to come back upstream and then capture it. And so now I would like to invite Yuri to come up and talk about the stresses in life and how we can deal with it in Bangkok.
All right, so the thing that we've noticed is that there are many water hyacinths throughout Bangkok. So for example, there are all of the motorbikes, and obviously there's a great socioeconomic value to it. It creates jobs, they're convenient, but a lot of people have called them stressful. They're a little bit dangerous, they block the roadways in a lot of the ways that water hyacinths do of the canals. And we've noticed there are many, many other such things around Bangkok. So here we go. So we went out into Bangkok and we found out what people actually think. So on February 3rd, 5th, and 7th, we actually went out and we conducted a lot of these workshops where we were teaching resilience and mindfulness. And part of it, though, was actually hearing feedback from everybody who lives throughout the different neighborhoods around here to see what they're actually thinking about their own personal water hyacinths. So when we talked to them, we spent last week talking to 30 people about the water hyacinths in their lives. And we saw stress. And for example, this is the BTS train station that's extremely crowded. So we see stress that happens outside. We see stress that happens also at the bus stations, so in a couple of different contexts. Some people submitted their offices, and so we see that it also travels to work. And then finally, someone submitted their shower. So obviously, water hyacinths also exist at home. But in contrast, we also saw joy. We asked people to submit some joyous places to us, and just to look into comparison of what some of the people have submitted for these photos compared to the last ones. So we start seeing people extending a little bit beyond Bangkok and some of the things you wouldn't normally associate with them. But it's a lot of serenity, and it's in different times of day. It's quiet, it's peaceful, it's green. And finally, this was one of them of just a completely empty cafe, just devoid of any water hyacinths that we normally see in the stressful places. So during the workshops, what we asked people to do is to analyze some of the most common locations around Bangkok. So this is a photo that we took of some people working. What we asked them to do is the different common locations were first of congestion. So it is escalators, wherever people are being crowded, rush hour, anything like that. That's we found to be a common area. Secondly, there were the open spaces. So it's like the parks, the cultural sites, where people actually have a little bit of space to move around. There were the streets. We noticed that on the street, it's not just a way to move from one place to the next, but it's really, there's commerce happening in some, there are markets. Streets are used for a number of different purposes. And finally, also transitions. Transitions are those spaces in between the major ones. So when somebody exits the train and they are about to get onto the street, it's the escalator that's about to take them there, or it's an elevator that goes from one floor to the next. These are some of the most common ones that we asked them to analyze. So we got the data. This is an example of one group. I believe this was a congestion group, then they were analyzing them. What we would ask them to do is to just put post-it notes of the major things they would notice and just a quick smiley face on if they think it's a good thing or a bad thing. And so then we began to cluster it, which is a design word for just grouping all of the different bigger themes. And so this is actually the living room in which in the apartment I'm staying at. And you can see all of the different groups happening for us trying to group them all together. And we noticed that some spaces were clearly bad. People in them it caused people to be passive, inactive, and isolated. So this is a group where people felt idle. This was something that emerged from all of the different negative spaces. So, for example, we had people feeling bored, stuck, waiting, bad planning. These were all of the negative emotions that people would feel. There were other spaces that were very clearly good, and they were causing people to feel connected, rested, and alive. So in contrast to the idle group from the bad place, in the good places, people instead would feel serene. It would be a park. A very common word that came up was chilling. And we noticed that there was a big distinction. So if somebody would just be waiting, some places they could take that action and they could color it to be bad. So for example, on the left side, if people were waiting in a negative space, they would say that they're waiting, they're bored, they're stuck. Contrast, there are some good spaces. And so if a person's just waiting in a good space, the place would be colored as chilling, employees looking for a quiet, peaceful place, or serene. And so an interesting spectrum began to emerge. On one hand, we have what we're calling the crowded space. So these are all of the spaces we saw that are the spaces of idle isolation. So it's the spaces that color everything to be negative. And then on the other hand, we have the lively spots. So it's all of the spaces of resilience and creativity. It's where people felt very at ease and calm. And now the most interesting part is that there's this ambiguous space in the middle. It's the spaces which can go either way. It really depends on the person. It depends on the type of day they're having. But it's this space that it could be bad, it could be good. It depends. So, for example, on the crowded side, we have very, very clearly, we had traffic, rush hour. A lot of the streets were places of stress, escalators, and the entrances to malls, surprisingly, felt crowded and negative. So, for example, this would be a crowded space. Then, on the other hand, we have on the lively side, we heard almost unanimously any parks or any cultural sites, they felt serene, peaceful, and good, so they belong on the lively side. So this is an image of a park that's like a good photo of something that feels lively. And now for the ambiguous spaces, we have the BTS, markets, and the pier. So in this case, we have, this would be an example photo of that somebody submitted. For some people, this could be crowded, annoying, and bad. For other people, they could see that there's commerce exchanging, it's lively, there's a lot of good happening here. And what we noticed, however, is that people spend most of their time on the left side. If you remember, a lot of the category there it was streets, escalators, traveling. People spend most of their time in the places they're long, they're unchanging, they're common, and they're unrelenting. They're always there. And then, but people didn't really spend that much time in the lively spaces. And the other thing that happens is that the lively spaces are precarious, meaning that if they're triggered, let's say there's a park, and it's a great lively space, but if the air is too polluted that day, no one's going to go there, and it becomes inaccessible. So that's why we see a lot of the people just standing on that side of the graph. And so we have the question on how might we start to adapt these spaces to become a little bit more lively, and how can we take ourselves and Bangkok as a city from the left side over to the right. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Paricha to discuss how we can actually move forward and adapt.
Thank you very much, Yuri. So before I try to address this question of how might we adapt these spaces to become better, I just want to reiterate the definition of crowded and lively. In the framework that you see previously, crowded means places that are associated with negative emotions, and lively means places that are associated with positive emotions. And of course, ambiguity are places where we heard people talk about both negative and positive emotions. As Yuri mentioned, the question that now that we have this understanding of the city of Bangkok, the big question becomes, how do we make our city a better place? And so we propose that there are 3 ways of doing this in order of difficulty. The first is to skew the ambiguous places and make it more positive. It's the easiest one because at the individual level, we heard everyone talk about that place on both ends of the spectrum. Some sees the BTS as lively, but some sees it as crowded. We think that can be fixed quite easily, so we say, let's talk about that first. The second way of doing this is to shift the crowded places to become more lively. This might be a little harder because some of these crowded places are pollution, trash, not something that maybe an individual can do. And then finally, we would like to strengthen the lively places so that it becomes less prone to triggers that you face in everyday life, or perhaps something that is totally outside of your control. And we're going to walk through these 3 kind of interventions that we propose and what that might look like for our city. So the first thing we want to talk about is to skew the ambiguous, moving from an ambiguous place to a lively place. This is a pier that I'm sure many of you have been to. It's the Sapan Taksin pier, where people can transition from the BTS SkyTrain down to take the boat to wherever they would like to go. From the workshop, we heard one person associate the pier with something that's old, it's unstable, it's kind of risky. She said, I might fall off the pier. To her, that's a crowded space. It's not something she would like to go to. However, with somebody in the same group, they were arguing about this when I was listening in. She said, well, you know what, the boats is actually a possible alternative for people to travel. And it gives me more choice, more freedom to go to somewhere where I want to go to. Same place, two different reactions. What do we do? One of the ways we do this is by generating questions as designers. We say, if it looks old and unstable, how do we make it feel safer? Is that on the aesthetic levels? Can we use paint? Make things look new again? Would that help them feel better? Or could we maybe add more guardrails, perhaps? It's a coincidence that it's yellow. I did not plan that. But guardrails, would that make it a visual cue for them to feel more at ease in this place? On the other side, we also have how do we make this mode of transportation more possible for more people? And one thing that I noticed that Sapan Taksin pier does very well is wayfinding. So there are maps like this showing where each line, or at least one service, would go, kind of tell people that there are possibilities. We can go where you want to go. So by generating from the data that we got, people's reactions, we can generate some questions and then move on to some solutions that work for us. I am not saying that these are the solutions that we must do, but rather these are possibilities that we should explore about how to make individuals feel differently about a certain crowded place, perhaps. I would like to close this little section with a mind map that we also did during the workshop. For this group in particular, they were mind mapping the emotion of feeling secure. And what we got out of that was, if we were to make a place more secure, 3 things that stood out to me certainly was, first, you must have an escape option. So you always know, that is the fire exit right there. I feel safe in case something happens. The second element that makes a place perhaps feel more secure is certainty. You know where you are, you know what to do, you know the timing of things, and for the pier itself, it could be about when the boat is gonna come, when the boat is gonna leave, which destination you're going to get off at. And then finally, very surprisingly, the elderly. We heard that having elderly people around makes them feel more secure in a place. We didn't have time to dig further into what that means exactly, but perhaps we can encourage more elderly people to walk around the city to make them feel better with the mask on, because it's pollution outside. Okay. So the second alternative, I guess the second approach we could do is negate the negatives, turn any crowded spaces into a more lively spaces. I'm going to go back to this picture of traffic. We heard so many people talk about traffic as being bad, or the smoke, the honking, the pollution, both emissions and sound, and also the motorbikes themselves makes it very messy. And so once again, as designers, what we do is we take this data and then we say, ask good questions, hopefully, how can we make the street safer, look cleaner? It might not have to be cleaner, but how do we make it feel cleaner to the people on the street? But also, how can we make it less noisy? Kind of dealing with pollutions of 2 kinds, right? Noise pollution, maybe emissions kind of pollution. And one way of doing this is to perhaps suggest converting our fleet to electric vehicles. Again, it's one of the solutions we can explore because electric vehicles has no emissions, and also at the source, at least, at the car, there's no emissions, and it actually drives a lot quieter than all the other cars. All the ICE cars, they can still honk. So I think that's another problem that it doesn't solve. But from my research, when I was studying at Stanford University, I did in-depth ethnographic interviews with over 20 electric vehicle users and found that there are multiple buckets of pain points that these users who are, by all definitions, a first adopter of electric cars, they have 3 different buckets of pain point depending on how long they've spent with the car. So at the beginning is the research phase where people are just starting to think about electric cars. In the middle, when they're starting to drive the cars, they also have their pain points because they've been using it for a while now, and there are some pains that are associated only with when you are driving and operating the car. And then finally, there are some users who have had it for so long that they are now starting to kind of having to maintain the cars. And what is more difficult about this approach is that some pain points are certainly at the individual level, but other pain points are definitely out of the control of people like you and me. For example, accessibility to charging. We cannot control where the charging ports go. We kind of depend on the charging ports like we depend on gas stations. And so negating the negative becomes a more difficult option for making our city a better place. And it involves more people in the community than just the people like us, like citizens of the city. And finally, we have strengthening the good. This is the Bang Kajao, which is the green lung of Bangkok. It's also reminiscent of a lively place that we hear a lot, which is like the Suan Lumpini. It's like a park. We proposed that perhaps because of triggers like the air pollution that we face every day, this place needs some strengthening somehow. If a trigger like air pollution comes by, we don't want the park, which is a refuge for people, to just become a crowded place again very quickly. What is very interesting to us is that malls are actually quite stressful. We saw multiple people submitting photos of malls, and we were wondering why that is. If you've been to a mall, that's a silly question. I think everybody has been to a mall. It's quite crowded. People go all the time. You don't know where to go. Let's go to a mall. And it's associated usually with exploration, shopping, food, friends, entertainment. All these things are in a mall. And this is actually a picture of someone submitting to the question of like, what place makes you stressful? And so we got very curious. We're not sure if we have the answer to why, but perhaps is it because there's a trigger in place, like the coronavirus, I guess, epidemic right now, that causes people to associate crowds with something bad and turns a normally lively place into a crowded place. So that's, again, a question that we leave open to you and to everybody to think about. But that's an observation about how malls could really be a good place, but is now a crowded place. And then finally, to end this presentation, I would like to briefly talk about the who. We've talked initially about the how, the framework, what's happening in the city, how do we turn crowded places into lively places, but we haven't quite touched on like who's going to do something about it. There's a book called Clash, written by Dr. Hazel Marcus and Dr. Alana Connor, that proposes this model called the culture cycle that actually posits that culture is created and changed through four different levels, 4 different layers within society. There are the individuals, the interaction between individuals, institutions, and big ideas that kind of governs what's going on within a society. I'd like to take an example about the plastic, the sustainability culture, and how that led to the plastic bag ban at the beginning of this year. So in this model, each layer can affect the other and reinforces the culture within the other. And so if we take a bottom-up approach from the individual level up, the plastic-free or sustainability movement might look something like this. At the individual level, all of us starts talking about plastics and how it's hurting the ocean. We start converting our consumer behavior towards using non-plastic bags. We talk to our neighbors, our friends about it. The institutions like shopping malls or even the government hears and of this trend and wants to support this. And so they pass a law or a policy internally within big corporations like the shopping mall to ban plastic bags. And that move kind of reinforces the idea of sustainability for Bangkok. A movement or a culture can also go from the top down, but so that the same movement can be explained from the top down as well. But what's important here is that there are different levels of players all interacting and reinforcing with each other to create some culture. So we take an inspiration from this model to explain perhaps how or who exactly might be able to help with some of these approaches. And quite simply, we think that the individual levels, communities, and institutions are responsible, or it is possible for these three levels of players to help with each approach. I think as you heard before, I talked about how ambiguous things can possibly be changed at the individual level. And from the shifting the negative part will probably require some help from the communities. In the case of electric vehicles, you switching to electric vehicles alone might not help as much. And then finally, in the last case where we want to strengthen the good, institutions will probably need to step in and kind of reinforce that culture, because with the virus, making a public space feel safe again probably starts with wearing face masks. But if you and all of us see each other wearing face masks, that's not a very safe way, it's not a very safe culture to see. And so it starts here at the individual level, but of course, let the big institution steps in as well. And so I would like to end the talk today with a number. That's about 10 million people. We have about 10 million people in this city. And the question of who can bring about positive change to Bangkok probably rests with all of us in this room and the residents of this city, whether you are acting as a citizen, a visitor, or someone with a role in government or in big companies that can affect change in institutions that care about the city. And to all of you in this room, I would like to propose a simple question that we started off with, which is, will you accept the challenge to overcome something you thought you couldn't for our city? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amplifi Design. A very, very well comprehensive talks from all of you. I believe that we will enter the Q&A session. We've got a couple of questions sent through from the audience. So let's have the first question. ขอคำถามแรกเลยนะคะ What have you learned about facilitating workshops with urbanites in contrast to people from urban, suburban or rural areas?คำถามก็คือว่าท่านได้เรียนรู้มี lesson learn อะไรนะคะจากการที่เข้าไปมีบทบาทในการ run workshop ที่มีความแตกต่างนะคะมีความแตกต่างอย่างไรบ้างระหว่างคนในเมืองกับคนที่อยู่ suburban รอบนอกแล้วก็คนในชนบทค่ะ
Can I in English?
Yes,
Is that
sure,
okay?
please.
Okay, yeah. I guess I will be extremely honest, and I don't think I've had enough experience facilitating workshops for people in the suburban or rural areas. So if you have any opportunities, I'd love to talk to you. But maybe we can say something about facilitating workshops in urban areas, which is that there are certainly constraints about time. We learned a lot about how there's a lot of stressors in their lives, which kind of flows into like kind of the workshop space that we have. And so what we did, which I think Yuri mentioned briefly, was that we did like a mindfulness exercise before we start doing any kind of design work to kind of ground them in the space that they're in and kind of make sure that they are here and being present. That might be the one like learning that I have. If you have anything to add, feel free to as well.
I think you covered it pretty well. I personally haven't facilitated any workshops for suburban or rural areas, but I've certainly done a lot of design research and work in those sorts of communities. And the biggest difference that you see is in terms of different cultures. So it's not a mystery that in a lot of the urban areas there are a lot of different people, and there's, I think especially in Bangkok, there's a huge culture of tourism and foreigners coming in and out, creating a very, very transient place where change is very easy to start and experiment with. And I think that's why a lot of design happens in urban areas. But in urban cultures or suburban cultures, the thing that you have to keep in mind of is that very often there's a very, very deep culture or that has a lot of heritage that is extremely important to keep in mind if you are going to do any sort of research or facilitating any sort of workshops there. I think that's the most important thing to keep in mind of.
Okay, now let's move on to the second question. How have you adopted resiliency design into your own lives, if at all?
Yeah, I have. I have definitely adopted it. I've been studying it, and at first, I was interviewing a lot of people about the stories of them being resilient, and I spoke to many special forces, emergency response workers, firefighters, and the most important thing that stands out as a very, very baseline step is to just become more mindful of the world that you live in. So sort of what we've been saying is that, you can't ignore a lot of these problems. You actually have to be present with them. And the way I've adopted resiliency, at least into my life, is to try to be a little bit more open and mindful of everything that happens around me, be it just trying to look at the trees a little bit more, feel the sun on my face, actually be present in the moment that I'm in. But then also being open to hear that if someone is actually genuinely having a problem, being open to discuss it with them and not just simply ignoring it. I think that's been actually a very, very pivotal change, and I know it has had a lot of personal impacts that I don't think is appropriate for this workshop, but it really has had a great benefit on my life.
Yeah, for me personally, I'm very stressed out with crowded places, and so usually when I go to work, I try to leave work a little bit early. So instead of going at 8 a.m., for example, I just start to leave home at 6:30 or 7 to avoid the crowds, and that makes me so much happier to get to work earlier as well and start working, rather than going rush hour and trying to get on a train, and it's just so stressful. And so, like Yuri saying, trying to be more mindful of your actions and how your actions can affect your feelings.
Would you like to add?
Sure, there's not much more to add, but definitely I became a lot more present, probably at work and the people I work with, about what makes you productive, what makes me stressed out, what environments make me stressed out, because as a design consultancy that's just starting out, I think I had to go to multiple locations, sometimes in a day, and what does that mean? Does taking the BTS during rush hour, I try to avoid that, and especially taxis during a happy hour, it's a big no-no. And so I notice what I feel when I feel good about the BTS, which is for me personally an emissions-free-ish mode of transportation. And so I would actually take the train to re-energize, to feel good about the fact that I traveled so much. And so I do see it a lot more in the way I work and in my own practices.
Okay, great. I've got a question for each one of you. It will be the same question. So I've noticed that all of you have worked with people and you are very into their emotions. So can you give us some example of the biggest lesson learned from working with them, and how would you, maybe just one thing that you like to share with the rest of the audience and that you think it's quite important for them to perhaps know about and adopt in their everyday life?
I need to think for a second.
I mean, it's quite wide.
Repeat the question
broad.
one more time. You're saying, what have we learned about?
So the
working
lesson
with
learned
people?
from any of your experience working with people regarding their emotions in order to come up with solutions. What would be your biggest lesson learned that you think is very important for them to know?
I think I'll start this off. From doing many in-depth interviews and talking to people as part of the design work, I feel like one of the lessons I always try to go back to is maybe to be curious about people, because for multiple reasons. Because first of all, when people smile or when people say something, that's not always what they mean. And if you work as a design researcher, it means that you should always keep in mind that you're trying to help them, but not to invade their space. We want to understand people as much as possible, how they feel, how they truly feel, and kind of have a conversation so they open up to you, to let you help them in a way. We're not there to judge. We're not there to say that we can help, because we don't know if we can help. But what helps me is that I'll always be curious, stay curious about the person that I'm talking to, and that usually works out pretty well. Yeah.
Great. Yuri?
I think the biggest lesson that I have learned, I've interviewed probably hundreds of people at this point, and one thing that I've noticed is that people are genuinely very open and very hungry to share some of their experiences and a lot of the things that they've had happen to them in their aspirations and hopes and dreams. And very often, something that I see a lot of fresh students or people who are just new in the field, what they'll do is that when they start talking to somebody, they'll be, the conversation will start with, oh, how are you doing? Oh, I am great. Things are fantastic. And then as soon as they get past that first level, they get so excited by getting a moment of genuine empathy with another person or hearing just the first part of somebody's story that they get so excited that they stop and they say, oh, job done. I've heard it all. And then they just take off with it. But meanwhile, there's so much more there. Everyone is such a enormous wealth of experiences and stories and families and networks and friends that I think it's, at least as a design researcher and then also as people, if you take, as Parisha said, a genuine curiosity to get into the details of another person's life and to really, really listen to them and to draw out more, I think you'll be surprised by some of the very, very heartfelt and emotional stories that you can hear.
Yeah, I think for me personally, it's really similar to Pibam and Yuri in a way that, learn to listen and be present when you're listening. Ask questions. What are they talking? If they're trying to explain their lives and their stories, be curious about their stories. Don't just stop at that level. Try to dig deeper, because people are willing to share. A lot of people, I feel, if you ask them enough questions, they will share. They will be very open about how they're feeling about many things. So.
Great, and those will be the tips for you in order to be resilient as a process for the future Urbanites. Now, please give them a big round of applause to the Amplify team. ขอเสียงปรบมือให้กับ Amplify team ด้วยนะคะเอาล่ะค่ะคุณปริชานะคะคุณยูริแล้วก็คุณเจนจิราค่ะ
Thank you.